Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our live coverage of this year's annual Spring Classic, the 102nd Panning of the Gold. And what a beautiful day it is for the sport of kings, of which I am a fan of. No, seriously, I'm just a fan. I was on my way to my seat and I saw that the door was open.
Hey, what are you doing?
Sorry about that, folks. But today, we're not going to be talking about the 102nd annual Panning of the Gold, so I'm sorry if you came here for that. I have no clue if that even exists. But today, we're going to be talking about DeadWood. And if you clicked on this video, thank you for your love and attention and clicking on this video. I love you. But today, we're going to be talking about DeadWood. And if you clicked on this video, like I said before, you probably are thinking about, you probably watched, you know, the HBO series or the docu-series. Jesus Christ.
What's going on?
Like I was saying, you've probably seen the DeadWood series, or at least have heard about it, and if you watch it, you probably thought it's a lot more fantasy-like and more close to fiction than non-fiction, because it really does, you know, over-exemplify and exaggerate a lot of the stuff from the Old West and the times back then. But if you really do look into the history of this place, it's kind of scary how the show kind of buttered it up. They kind of sugarcoated this stuff, because it really, people just did not give one single shit back then. They did not care. Today we're going to be talking about just those people that conquered the West and set it out for all these other people to live all these years later. And ironically, how DeadWood was founded was right after the Civil War had ended, during the Manifest Destiny era of the whole migration out west, where General George Custer got some sort of permit or pardon or something like that from the government to go out in South Dakota and find some sort of plot of land that was good enough for him to build a fort at, so they could, you know, obviously hold ground against the Indians back then, because back then there were a lot of wars between Indians and between
Americans and Indians.
Because there was a lot of stuff during Manifest Destiny where the government was saying, hey, we got this federal land, and we'll just give you this federal land if you start farming and building on it. If you build enough property on it, you just own the land. We'll give it to you for free. And a lot of these people that would just take this land and build on it for free because the federal government told them to, it was really owned by different, you know, Indian tribes, Native Americans, that went out and just would see these people building on their land, and rightfully so, would, you know, start murdering them and killing them. Well, I don't know if that's, you know, really rightfully. Maybe you can go over there and be like, hey, watch out, you know, but different times. And obviously when these Americans would move, the tension between them and the Indians would grow tighter and tighter until the government would have to get involved, and that's probably why General Custer had to go out there and build a fort. And when he was out there going to build the forts, he went out in the Black Hills, which is now where the, what is it called? What are the monuments called, or whatever?
Mount Rushmore?
Yeah, the big stupid faces.
The presidents.
No, like, what's it actually called? Is there a name for the whole thing?
Mount Rushmore.
So that's what the name of the statues?
Yes.
That's stupid.
It's Mount Rushmore.
But isn't it just on the mountain that's called Rushmore? Isn't that the name of the actual mountain though?
The monument is Mount Rushmore.
On Mount Rushmore? So if you go there, you'd be on Mount Rushmore? New York! So when General George Custer was out looking for a good spot to place this fort with him and his men, there just happened to be two prospectors in this group with him out looking for, you know, gold, obviously, because what else are you going to do when you're just walking across the country? You're looking for a fort, you're going to look for gold. And these guys came upon some gold in the southern part of the Black Hills, and that's what would really start the gold rush in this part of Dakota, because at this time it wasn't South Dakota and North Dakota, it was just Dakota. Now these two men would find this gold in the summer of 1874, and just a year later in 1875, a group of prospectors would set up camp in the northern part of the Black Hills in a gulch, which a gulch, if you don't know what it is, it's pretty much just a really small valley with a body of water in the middle of it. And this gulch was just full of dead trees. And these miners would eventually find gold there. And that's what would start the entire downtown district of DeadWood, as you know today, probably, of all the prostitutes and all that stuff. That just started as pretty much just a mining camp, as most of them started, in the middle of this field of dead trees. And that's literally why it was called DeadWood, was because all these people that wanted to go to this town had to walk through a gulch of dead trees to get there. And now in August of 1876, the official city of DeadWood was laid out in the city planning. Thousands of miners would come upon this area, mainly for the gold, but also because the city planning started, they started building, brothels, hotels, general stores, gambling establishments. So if you found some gold, you could have some fun with it too in this town. So it was kind of an all, buy one, get one free, all, one-stop shop. It was kind of like the Disneyland of the Old West back then, you know what I mean? You can go in there, you can get one of those giant hot dogs and a stupid Mickey hat, but back then it was just a cowboy hat and like beef jerky, I guess. I mean, this place became so established, they even had their own newspaper established June of that same year. So from 2 years, it went from just a forest with a couple of tents in it to literally a booming, pretty much town of a couple of thousand people that had their own newspaper. It's absolutely insane what logistics people had back then, and all they had were wagons and revolvers. And the funniest part about this whole early era of this town is that it was so early in the Manifest Destiny era that South Dakota wasn't even officially a state at this point. But the town would annually celebrate 4th of July every year and would pretty much have a huge block party for the whole town, even though literally they wouldn't be ratified as a state until 1889, which is
13 years later.
Hey, editor me. It's 1876 to 1889, so I did the year wrong. Just put robot voice. Corrected. And now a man named Colorado Charlie Utter would organize a wagon train from George, Colorado to pretty much any of the gold rushing prospector towns around Deadwood in the Black Hills, like Lead or what was the other one?
Spearfish,
Custard, Sturgis. I'm thinking of these all on my own. And now this wagon train would head to Cheyenne, Wyoming to pick up almost over 100 passengers at some points. And this is how a lot of famous people from the show literally got to Deadwood, was on these wagon trains, like Wild Bill Hickok and Calamity Jane. There were even a couple of girls named Madam Mustache and Dirty Earn. And they were working girls, which,
Dirty M.
Dirty M?
M.
I don't even want to know what that means. And it's crazy how volatile life was back then, because Wild Bill would arrive there in July and got shot by Jack McCall only 4 months later in a poker game. So it's crazy back then. Literally, you would arrive in a town and you'd be like, oh, I'll be here for a couple of weeks and I'll leave. And then you're dead. You'll wake up dead. Now, Jack McCall, the guy I mentioned before who shot Wild Bill,
got arrested.
But he would be acquitted of a minor's court, which I don't know what a minor's court is. Sounds like some crazy shit Dream would have. But he got acquitted by the court with no jury, and he just fled from Deadwood. And because of that, the Dakota Territory's authorities would pick him up and hang him in the following week. So it's not like he didn't get the justice he deserved, but still, it's absolutely insane. Like, if I just started shooting people in a casino in Las Vegas for being mad at my cards, I would just get thrown in prison. I wouldn't even have a chance to be able to run away. Like, that's just crazy. Like, a whole crowd of people just saw this guy shoot him at a poker game because he was angry at him. And then, the authorities were like, yeah, just let him go. He'll probably come back, whatever. And the most crazy part about this story is with most gunslingers back then, we don't really know what happened to them or where they're buried, really, because most of the people back then were just buried in unmarked graves by relatives that just would throw them in a hole and throw a rock over it, because they just didn't have the money for the expenses back then to even, afford a coffin, some of them. The gravestone and all of his funeral expenses were paid by the man I mentioned before, Colorado Charlie Utter. That's his full name. I don't know if it's because he's from Colorado or that's literally his name. I'm not really sure. But the epitaph would state, Wild Bill J.B. Hickok, killed by the assassin Jack McCall in Deadwood, Black Hills, August 2nd, 1876. Pard, we will meet again in the happy hunting ground to part no more. Goodbye, Colorado Charlie C.H. Utter. And a couple years after the burial, Charlie would move Wild Bill's remains to Mount Moriah Cemetery. And you remember what I was getting into before, saying that a lot of the stuff in the show was sugar-coated, even though it still is a pretty messed up show, is the preacher from the show. The man he's really based off of was preacher Henry Weston Smith. And preacher Henry Weston Smith literally has a statue of him up in one of these towns. I can't remember which town it is. I'll put it up on screen. But whichever town it is, they have a statue of him up there because he was walking to that town and he got murdered in the street by some man and he was stabbed to death just walking to go do a sermon. I mean, it is still really messed up, him in the show going and deteriorating, having all those crazy seizures and stuff. But I think it's way more messed up if they just had him in the show And he was just like, all right, I'll see you later, fellas. I'll see you next time. Ooh, I'll be in the next episode. Ooh, oh my God, I'm being stabbed. And now in the official records, DeadWood actually really blames the death of that preacher on a lot of Native Americans in the area because there were a lot of tensions between the Americans and the Native Americans in the area at that time. And because of that, there were a lot of just fights between Americans and Native Americans back then. Like I said in my last video, the guy that got his jaw shot open in Aurora by that Native American that was trying to help him walk back to his town. Literally, the guy was like, oh, I'll come and help you out. I mean, I know it was probably just some Indian dude that was, disgruntled with all these, Americans coming into his area. But I like to imagine it was just some white guy walking down the street being like, yes, how are you, sir? Time to die. And now this summer, the estimations of the population would fluctuate from anywhere between 5,000 and 10,000 people. So I think this would indicate that the prospecting was really starting to pick up at this moment because there were a lot of dudes coming in, spending all their money on claims, trying, either getting a lot, leaving, or not getting anything and still leaving, either with a pocket full of gold or a pocket full of lint. There were just people coming and going, either for the gold or for the giggity, giggity, giggity. And this is around the time when Lawrence was actually established as a county by the governor. And the same governor would appoint Seth Bullock as the first sheriff of DeadWood. And around the same time is when Al Swearinger opened up the Gem Variety Theater. And around the same time, at the end of the year in December, is when the first telegraph was actually implemented in DeadWood. And this first telegraph was put there in 1876, December 1st. And the first telegraph was literally made in 1832. So literally a little over 40, or a little under 40 years of the telegraph being around. And it's already expanding over to states where they're not even states yet. It's absolutely insane how fast technology used to spread back then. We think technology spreads really fast now, but even for back then, that's pretty crazy.
Messages from invisible sources, or what some people think of as progress.
Well, it seems to me like letters posted one person to another is just a slower version of the same idea.
When's the last time you got a fucking letter from a stranger?
Bad news about Paul.
Bad news.
And around the same time is when this real mining entrepreneur, the Elon Musk of gold showed up back then. His name was George Hurst, and he would buy the Manuel brothers' claim for $70,000. And he would use that claim to establish the Homestake Mining Company in June of that next year. And around the summer or fall of that same year, a federal judge named Granville Bennett would tell Lawrence County that they would have to actually hold a real election because the appointment that Seth Bullock had was technically illegal, because for you to be a sheriff, you actually have to be elected to that office, and everyone kind of was just like, yeah, he's the sheriff. And there wasn't really an official ballot or anything for that.
Be over in a couple of hours. We gotta form a government for the settlement.
Who does?
Us. You and me. Come to me in a vision, you stupid bastard.
So then they had an actual election where Seth Bullock would run against another man named John Manning, where he would ultimately lose in the election, just like in the show.
I'm busy over here. I'm reading about democracy.
What are you reading about?
Democracy.
But in what?
The Encyclopedia Britannica Book of the Year 1954. Events of 1953.
You're just reading a fucking dictionary?
No. An encyclopedia.
Whatever, it's the same fucking thing.
No.
You're a fucking nerd.
Mm-hmm.
And this was the period right before the Chinese Exclusion Act, where America started mass deporting Chinese laborers and putting a 10-year ban on Chinese laborers from entering the country. And because of that, and even the downer-towner parts of DeadWood would become known as Chinatown, and a lot of Chinese, work immigrants that were mainly there to work on trains, but most of them there were prospectors too. And a lot of them went from laying trade tracks and blazing saddles to mining for gold like Bruce Willis in Armageddon.
He wasn't mining for gold.
What are you talking about? How do you know?
Because he was trying to save the earth.
And around this time, because of all the Chinese immigrants coming into town looking for gold, they had a lot of other needs too, like, food, gambling, booze, and women. So a man named Fi Li Wang would come into town and would establish an emporium called the Wing Su Emporium, and later him and his wife and his whole family would eventually establish themselves in Deadwood.
Switching?
All right, Wu.
Woo! America!
And on September 26th, a fire would start in a bakery on Sherman Street, which would completely destroy almost the entire bustling town. Because, you know, the entire place was made out of deadwood. And even though this fire would literally leave 2,000 of the residents of Deadwood homeless, they would rebuild almost the entirety of what the fire took away from them in only 6 months. And this time they would replace it with mostly brick and stone structures so that that wouldn't happen again. And obviously, that stuff wasn't made out of deadwood. I just got like 15 kids floating around this country because that was a dad joke.
Yo, mama!
Also, I don't have any kids. That was also a dad joke. And right after they rebuilt the entire town pretty much after that disaster, the first electric lights were put into Deadwood just that December. And South Dakota legislatures would establish the first prohibition law in American history, which would make the selling of alcohol illegal. And that law would go into effect May 1st of 1889. And a couple months later, the Dakota territories would split into 2 states, and North and South Dakota would both be granted their official statehood November 2nd. And because of the dwindling amount of gold in the area, and on top of that, the fire burning down the majority of the town, the census in 1890 would say that the population would go from anywhere between like 5,000 to 10,000, that it would drop to only 2,300 residents, but that's still crazy. That means that most of those are probably the people that literally got their houses burnt down that rebuilt them, because it said about 2,000 people would become homeless, so that's crazy, you know? Homeless people today, they just go find some like piece of woods to go live behind my house or some crazy shit. You know, back then they were like, oh, I'm homeless, I'm gonna go build a house right there. I don't care. And only a few short weeks later, the U.S. 7th Cavalry would surround a group of Lakota Indians and try to escort them to a reservation. But when one deaf Indian would fail to give up his rifle because obviously he couldn't hear them, they would shoot and kill 146 men, women, and children. And this act from the United States Cavalry would effectively end the Indian Wars of the late 1800s. And a couple years after this massacre occurred, another fire would almost devastate the entirety of Deadwood again. Like, I don't understand how all these old towns just kept getting set on fire. Like, they couldn't figure out anything to stop these fires. Like, it's just absolutely insane to me how I research, you know, and look at a lot of different stuff for a lot of different ghost towns because I think they're very interesting. And most of them, they either end in just a lot of people leaving because there's not enough alcohol, or they just leave because the whole place is on fire. And this fire would devastate almost the entirety of the Main Street business district in Deadwood. And Seth Bullock, who had a general store there, got his business burnt down. And after that, he started constructing a 3-story tall, 64-room hotel made out of sandstone. That's just what he did. Seth Bullock, he woke up on fire and he said, I gotta build a new house, brother. And the hotel would remain as a mainstay in Deadwood as a historical landmark, and some people even say that Seth Bullock's ghost roams the halls, making sure that nobody else sets fire to his fucking buildings again. And then Governor Arthur Millett would add a gambling provision to the South Dakota law, which would make gambling completely illegal in the entire state, which is kind of insane because that's pretty much what built the entire state up to what it is, and the guy's just coming in there and he's like, meh, I don't think you guys should be able to make bets with your own money, Sam. Yeah. And because of these now prohibitive laws unallowing gambling in the whole entire state, the Gem Theater would be going under reservations to be accommodating those laws. And during that time, the Gem Theater would be lit on fire for the 3rd time. The Gem Theater literally got lit on fire on the first 2 fires, and they lit themselves on fire one time just for fun.
Come on, Boogie, let's burn this motherfucker down!
And that's when firefighters would arrive on scene and discover that someone had stolen the hydrant wrenches to actually open up the fire hydrants.
There were 37 amateur fire brigades, and they all fought each other.
The gem burns to the ground for the third and last time, and Al Swedgen would just leave Deadwood after that because, you know, for him, six times. 6 times was the chop for me for the bar. Oh, you blend. And now in 1901, Calamity Jane would return to Deadwood because she would be traveling across a couple of different towns that she would travel in. And in her travels between, you know, Deadwood and a couple other places, she would end up in a neighboring town named Terry, where she would eventually get pneumonia and pass away in a hotel in Terry. And after people in Deadwood had heard of her passing, a lot of businessmen in Deadwood would jump on the opportunity to take her corpse from Terry and put her to rest right next to Wild Bill Hickok. And the only reason they did that literally was just so they could have more people come into the town for more tourism and more money. That was literally the whole reason they're there together. I don't think they're there together for any other reason. I mean, they might have known each other and they might have been friends, but there's very few records even saying that. I mean, they probably knew each other. They rode on the same wagon to Deadwood, so they probably, you know, saw each other and talked to each other for a little while, but they weren't really knowing each other to the point of literally burying them next to each other, which it's pretty funny to me that there were even people back then that they see someone dead and they're instantly like, 3 a.m. challenge? I just talked to Logic from the grave? What did Logic say about suicide after he killed himself? 3 a.m. Ouija board Logic challenge?
Are you okay?
I got Quaaludes, lemon 737s, the boy from Brooklyn, the big man is back. The big man is from Brooklyn.
The Quaaludes! Bring back the fucking Quaaludes!
I think you just broke my foot.
And the now former gem owner Al Swearingen was found bludgeoned to death in a train yard November 15th of that same year. It's kind of insane how when you get run over by a train, it looks exactly like 4 dudes beating you up with baseball bats in the desert. And now around the same time, Seth Bullock was actually appointed to, What the fuck is that?
It's a chalk outline of a body.
It's a what?
It's a chalk outline of a body.
When did that happen?
It was a wild one last night.
What?
Whoops. I actually stabbed you that time, sorry.
No, like really, what happened last night, dog?
Nothing, don't worry about it.
And around the same time, just like all my favorite stories, Teddy Roosevelt just shows up out of the fucking blue and appoints Seth Bullock as the U.S. Marshal of South Dakota. Goddamn. I love Teddy so much. This is my little Teddy. I named him Little Teddy. Don't you love me, Little Teddy? Don't touch me! And in May of that same year, newspapers report that Harrison Franklin's son, Nathan, has purchased the first modern automobile that would reach Deadwood. A couple of years after the automobile's invented, because this was in like 08 to 1910, I'm pretty sure, around when this first car was there. Like, the first car was invented, like, not even, a decade ago. And there's already a dude driving around in Deadwood, which is, gotta show you something about how technologically advanced this, place is, for how far out it is from real, like, developed society, as people would usually say. And for the 9 years that Seth Bullock would hold the position as U.S. Marshal, him and Teddy Roosevelt would actually reportedly become really good friends, which, God, I'm so envious of that guy. And around the same time when the first automobile became apparent in Deadwood, they started paving the roads with bricks, and even an automotive garage would be installed there in around the 1910. And around in that same year, the population would rise to about 3,600 people. And Lawrence County would finally start turning wagon roads that were starting to become obsolete into highways so that they could actually have cars start driving through their town, because if you think about it, this whole time, the only thing that's really kept Deadwood alive is tourism and dudes being gross. And now in the year 1919, the late great President Theodore Roosevelt would die that year. And in that same year, Seth Bullock would actually put up a monument in his honor, and it would be the first monument that would ever be up of President Theodore Roosevelt. That's how quick this guy got it up. All you slackers out there now putting up enough goddamn President Theodore Roosevelt statues in your fucking closets.
Why are they in the closet?
What? And Seth Bullock would dedicate that monument to Theodore Roosevelt, and he would name it the Freedom Tower.
I think it was the Friendship Tower.
What do you mean? What's the difference? And not long after putting up this monument to his friend, Seth Bullock would die at the age of 70 on
September 23rd, 1919.
And now in 1920, the United States Congress would pass the most unpopular and epic law that they would ever pass, which would be the Prohibition Act, the most genius act of, hey, we don't want people to drink alcohol, so let's just put ethanol in all of it and kill everybody. It's a grand idea. And although Prohibition would shut down the saloons in DeadWood, this actually would kind of revitalize DeadWood, because the original purpose for people coming to DeadWood really was illegal gambling and illegal, whatever you would want. And because of this new niche that they found, it kind of revitalized DeadWood into becoming another mainstay for a lot of speakeasies and a lot of, underground saloons under there. In August 2nd of 1922, the first Days of 76 celebration would be held in DeadWood. And the celebration would pretty much be there to celebrate the coming of age of the entire town and really the maturity growing in it, from being just like an outback, low down place where just prospectors and, not very respectable people go, and then, turn more into a normal community like it is today. They even hold this Days of 76 event annually every summer. And it's pretty much just a rodeo event, parade where you go around and there's games and stuff, and you can go, bring your kids in front of a giant wild bull where they tie up their balls. It's a great idea. Bring your entire family and put them right at the front row. Please. And a couple months later, Neil Perigo and Marianne Wood would write a stage play about the trial of Jack McCall, which was the man who shot Wild Bill Hickok. And you can still see that play to this day in DeadWood, which is pretty cool that this entire place has, been set on fire, and there's even a couple of floods in its history that I didn't even really mention because I didn't want to make the video too long. And, there's fires and floods and all that stuff, and, nothing could really keep this town from just being like, I want to make a 20 on red. I'm feeling red. And in 1978, the designation of the entire, Badlands downtown section of DeadWood would be designated as a national park. And now in 1933, the Prohibition Act would finally be lifted on DeadWood, which would make gambling and alcohol start flourishing in the state again. Even though it was already, bustling, it made it flourish even more now that they didn't have to hide behind closed doors. And now, a couple years after 1939, when World War II started, gold mining companies in South Dakota were marked unessential companies and were deemed unnecessary of government funding, so the Homestead Mining Company started shutting down at this point. And because the Homestead Mining Company was labeled unessential to the government, they had to start doing something to be, essential to the government and the war effort. So they literally started producing hand grenades that you can literally see people using in World War II. It's pretty cool. And a couple years later, law enforcement officials would raid DeadWood's gambling establishments to try to get rid of them once and for all. But all that would really do would just make them be a little bit more underground and a little bit more secret and on the down low about that shit. That's literally all that did. And around this time, the South Dakota State's Attorney started going after gambling and brothels much more seriously around this point. Probably just to, ensue some political venture. They probably didn't even really care, but if they did, that's kind of lame. Either way, it's really lame, because who really cares? Gambling and brothels, even if you make them illegal, all that's going to make that happen is just make it so some dude is just going to do it in a way more shady way, in a way less safe way, and make the entire thing way more shady for everybody. So, all that really serves to do is just put down us and have the government make a little bit more money. And like I said before about them becoming hard on crime, like, two consenting adults having sex, the state's attorney started really going after brothels to try to make them illegal. And I'm not kidding, a brothel attorney named Roswell Bodum succeeds in getting all of the mistresses of the night acquitted. The guy was literally named the brothel attorney. How do I get that? Can I be named the brothel guy?
Is pimping easy? Hell yeah.
Somehow that is correct.
And another raid would occur in 1959 on these brothels to try to shut them down, but it failed to even close one of the brothel houses down. So that really didn't do absolutely anything other than just get a couple of cops to see a couple of boobies for like 5 minutes. So it's probably cool for those guys. And of course, because the place is called DeadWood, a wildfire would start, of course, in this place, and it would make all the residents of DeadWood have to evacuate. And they got the fire under control by the next day, but by that time, it had already burned over 4,000 acres of land. And a couple years later, a limited stakes gambling bill would be released in DeadWood, which would make gambling illegal again in this town. So it's been, illegalized, illegalized, and then legalized again, but partially legalized this time, because now you can only make a maximum bet of $100, or I think it's $1,000. No, I'm sorry, it's it's $100. And a portion of the money that the house would make from gambling would be taken from the state as a tax to be able to restore some historical parts of DeadWood. The Braddock Gold Corporation, who now own the Homestead Mine, would officially close the Homestead Mine for the last time, which it's been open on and off at this point for literally 126 years, which would make it the longest running and most profitable mine in the Western Hemisphere, which is just absolutely yonkers, mate. Absolutely yonkers. I'm gonna dedicate this one to my friends Terry and Therese in the pen. And if you're wondering what's happening with the Homestead mine nowadays, you might just think it's some old abandoned mine, but no, the South Dakota Science and Technology Department, they thought, there's this giant underground facility, let's just turn it into a giant underground laboratory. And that's literally all the information I got about that, so you could just think about whatever SCP horrors you want to imagine are under there, under the ground in South Dakota, right next to Mount Rushmore. Literally in the same Black Hills as Mount Rushmore. That's where the laboratory is. It's literally like Team America. It's literally the same exact thing as Team America. And just if it wasn't getting bad enough for DeadWood, the South Dakota legislators would literally pass a law to make a statewide ban on public smoking.
Are they smoking? Or are they gay? It's okay to smoke.
So that meant that really affected all the gambling and bars in DeadWood, because, if you think about it, if anyone's really going to be smoking in a bar or a casino, it's going to be the dudes that are in the middle of DeadWood. That's like exactly like, I can't even imagine a bar in DeadWood without dudes smoking like giant cigars. Like, it just doesn't make sense to me. But South Dakota legislatures are just like, your secondhand smoke is making me thirsty. I'm quite parched, sir. You need to get rid of this smoke. But even though South Dakota's been getting a lot of bad stuff happening recently, they just got their, gambling thing lifted a little bit so that their maximum bet went from $100 to $1,000. So that was pretty cool that, in 2012 you can bet more than $100. Like, could you imagine you walk in somewhere and you got like $100 grand on you to be gambling, and the dude's like, no, you can only bet 0.1% of your entire bank value per turn, sir. And you're just gonna be sitting there like, dude, this is boring as hell. I came here to make some Monopoly money, sir. On July 27th of 2016, Chief David Beautiful Bald Eagle would pass away, and the reason that this is significant is he was the man that for decades of his life, he would lead the entire parade of 76 going through the entire, town, which was pretty much a reenactment of the parade that they had when the original wagon came into town. The original wagon I talked about in the beginning of the video of more than 100 people coming in. They, after they came into town, they all marched through town and had music and drank as a parade to celebrate that they made it. And to honor the making of the town, Chief Bald Eagle would lead these parades for decades until the day of his death in 2016. when he died at the age of 97, which is absolutely insane to think of a dude living that long. The guy was living so long, he lived before like cars and stuff, and he died with like the internet and like the Xbox.
Yo mama's so stupid, she bought tickets to Xbox Live!
And that's pretty much it. DeadWood is still a town to this day, and you can visit it right now if you want. There's a lot of hotels and restaurants and events that go on there to this day that really honor the historic impact that DeadWood has had. And it really has had a really crazy historic impact, because I have read a lot about a lot of different ghost towns, and it's crazy how like primitive of a life they led compared to like the city folk of back then. Because nowadays, between city folk and like farmers, it's really not that different, because they all have like the internet, they all have like iPads and stuff. The real difference between like internet and city folk nowadays is really just like the space between how close you and your neighbor are. That's really the main difference nowadays. Where back then, it was a myriad of differences, where if you look at a lot of different ghost towns, like it took them decades after electricity became a thing for them to get lights in the streets, and it took them even longer to get paved roads for cars to be able to go into those towns, because a lot of those towns just weren't as big as DeadWood. Because, you know, when you have a town like DeadWood, it's good for DeadWood, but it's really bad for neighboring towns if they don't make a lot of gold or a lot of silver money, because that's just what keeps these towns alive back then. It's just pure, simple supply and demand. If you have no gold, there's no reason for the prospectors to go there. If there's no reason for the prospectors to go there, the prostitutes and the bar owners are going to make nothing. So, you know, they're going to move over to another town, and the other town they're going to move over to is probably going to be like DeadWood or Lead or Terry or any of these other ones that are still standing today, because obviously they were popular enough to live that long. And it's really cool because a lot of these towns, they don't really have that big of communities, but the communities that they have are very, you know, tight-knit, and they know a lot usually about the town that they live in. Because if you don't know a lot about it, you're going to learn a lot about it from a lot of stupid tourists coming in the bar being like, oh my god, I just went on this crazy thing on a tour. Did you know that Wild Bill Hickok just fucked your mom in the back of my fucking Toyota Camry? What?
Nothing.
What are you reading? Like, what are you actually reading over there? Like,
I was just starting to read about socialism.
Oh, okay. So she's read about communism, democracy, and socialism.
And fascism.
I'm fucked. And that's the coolest thing about these towns, is what really keeps them alive is American tourism. And the coolest thing about that is there's not a lot of countries where, if you go to a lot of other countries, there's not a lot of, you know, in-country tourism that most countries can do, because most countries just aren't as big as America is. And, you know, Canadians and Europeans, they do have a lot of places they can go to, but just not to the same extent that Americans can, because it's just like, it's, you know, you got like all 15 Minecraft biomes, and you got like, you know, 50 states that are kind of just 50 countries masquerading as one state, so that
the entire world doesn't need 50 more flags.
That's pretty much all it is, you know? And all I gotta say really is, if you really did watch DeadWood, the show, before you watch this video, there are an insane amount of similarities between the show and, you know, real life. And the craziest part about it is the set directors and, like, the prop designers of that show did an absolutely immaculate job. Like, it literally looks like they just went in a time machine and just went back there and just stole everything from the actual place and just went back and were like, here you go, here's your general store sign. Like, the set design, the costume design, the makeup, everything in that show is just very insanely good. And if you haven't seen DeadWood yet, I would highly recommend you go see it, because even a lot of the stuff I did talk about in this video really doesn't pertain to a lot of the stuff that happens in the show, because a lot of the stuff that happens in the show, you know, obviously they take creative liberties to make a TV show, and, you know, a lot of it is just, you know, done up for TV. So, you know, most of the stuff in the TV show did actually, you know, happen in real life, but take it with a grain of salt, you know what I mean? All I gotta really say is, you know, thank you for watching the video, and if you got all the way down to this part, it would really be cool if you hit those like and subscribe buttons on your Doom brick or on your Doom rectangle. That would be really cool. And the coolest part about the show is that almost everybody that's in the show is actually based on a real person, other than Mrs. Garrett, which is literally one character in the show. everybody in the show is based on a real historical person in some sort of ledger or some sort of letter or something. You know what I mean? So, oh no. I'm gonna go cook up some grilled cheese French toast sandwiches with my mom. Gonna make a couple of grilled Charlies on the barbie.
Yum.
Yep. All right. Well, let's get out of here. Come on. Leave. Get out of my fucking room.
I'm going. Jeez. Mean.
Oh.